The Constitution, Lesson 2. Today we will be talking about how the Constitution came to be written and the different compromises, etc., that went into producing the document. The first plan we will look at is the Virginia Plan. We will contrast it with the New Jersey Plan. Under this plan, there were three branches that were allotted for, and a bicameral legislature, which means two houses. This is eventually what we will come to know as our own American government, which is the House of Representatives and the Senate. The number of representatives under this plan was based on the state's population as well as equality. There was an argument about statehood and about how representation would be determined. Some states wanted it to be equal. They thought that each state should have the same amount of pull in the national government. Others argued that if one state is equal to another, the populations aren't equal. So the larger states would not have as much of a say-so in the government as the smaller states. The smaller states' votes would actually count for more, percentage-wise, based on population. So under the Virginia Plan, they compromised and did both. The main presidential power under this plan was veto. The New Jersey Plan was a little bit different. Instead of three branches, they allotted for two. A unicameral legislature means one house, and only one, like a parliament, would be allotted for under this plan. This plan called for equality representation on states, so they did not take into account population, and this plan was not as popular. Under this plan, the president's main power was economic, by taxing. Let's talk about compromise. There are three that we will look at: the Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and the Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise. Under the Great Compromise, this was a solution to the arguments that the Founding Fathers had when determining representation. Under this compromise, they decided there would be a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate. The Senate taking equality, and the House taking representation by population. This satisfied both ends of the argument and was a good solution. The Three-Fifths Compromise came about when Southern states were determining representation in the House. Southern states wanted to count their slave population, even though slaves had no rights at this point and were not considered citizens. This would work in the advantage of the South because they would be getting more representation in the House if they could count their slave population. The North didn't like this because it would give the South more power in the House, and eventually the North, where we have lots of abolition, would want to get rid of slavery. So if they gave the South the ability to count their whole entire slave population, the South could potentially vote to never get rid of slavery. The North didn't like this for this reason and for many others. The Three-Fifths Compromise said that we could count in the South the slave population so long as it wasn't one for one, but 3/5 of a person when determining the population of that particular state. The Commerce and Slave Trade Compromise denied Congress to tax the export of goods from state to state. This interstate commerce would be something that colonists would have to deal with under the Constitution and citizens in the future, but for now, that problem was solved. And slavery was the other issue, and that had to do with the South being worried about slavery being abolished. Southern states recognized how important slavery was to their economic system as well as their social system. They worried that if they joined the Union and signed the Constitution, that the North would abolish slavery once the pen ink was dry. And so the North had to kind of appease the South and dangle a carrot, and they said, if you sign and ratify the Constitution, Congress will not have the power to act on the slave trade for 20 years. So it was a 20-year deal that the South knew that their economic and social system would be intact. This led the South to also ratify eventually the Constitution of the United States. The convention approved its work in September of 1787. Two groups of people that came from this convention were grouped into Federalist and Anti-Federalist. Federalist supported the Constitution. They said, this is great, let's ratify it, this Constitution is awesome. Anti-Federalists are like, hold up, wait a second, what about the people's rights? Because the Constitution set up the government and didn't address those rights that should be guaranteed to the people, the Anti-Federalists were strongly against it. And that is why the Bill of Rights was ratified or added to the Constitution right after the ratification, because this was the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, or 10 changes that added citizens' rights to the Constitution. Now, within the Constitution, you will find 6 basic principles. They are popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and federalism. Please write each of these 6 in the graphic organizer bubble. You will want to define each one within each little bubble as you go. Popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means power comes from the people. And this is important with the Founding Fathers. So that government power has to come from the people. This means that the people have to, by abiding by the laws in the Constitution of the United States, give their power over to the government so that the government can help all of us out. If we, the people, decide that we want our power back under popular sovereignty, we can do a few things. We can vote people that we've elected out of office, and probably the most extreme or radical would be that we could have another revolution, and that would be one way that we could take our power back from the federal government. This is popular sovereignty. Limited government means that government is limited and is not all powerful in what it can do, that there are restrictions, and that government cannot do anything that it wants to do. It can't regulate who we marry and when we marry and if we have children and so on and so forth. Just personal rights and freedoms that we are guaranteed in the United States, for instance, are not guaranteed in other countries, and this kind of allows us that ease and freedom that, hey, we've got these rights and the government can't do whatever the heck it wants to do. Separation of powers was important, and that is that the colonists were afraid of giving one executive branch all of the power, and so they spread the power out over 3 branches of government. That would be legislative, executive, and judicial. They are separate, they have separate powers, but they are all co-equal, that one is not more important than the other. Now, checks and balances are just ways that government can check up on each other within these 3 branches. And essentially what it means is that it takes basically 2 branches to do any one thing in government. So, for instance, while the legislative branch, which is made up of Congress and the House of Representatives and Senate within Congress, can pass laws, the President, which is the executive branch, must sign off or veto those laws. Now, there are loopholes within this system, but it is set up so that one branch cannot do anything without the approval of another branch. Judicial review, and this basically is the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has this huge power of determining whether government actions or people's actions or laws are constitutional. The cool thing about the Supreme Court is that whatever they decide applies to everybody in the country. So while they are appealed or petitioned to hear thousands of cases every year, they only choose a few. And when we get to that unit, we'll talk about how do they know which ones they should choose. Federalism. And this is power divided between in a different way, and that is powers divided between the national and then local governments. So our national government, we can also call our central government or our federal government, and this is the 3 branches. Now, within that, in a lesser extent, we have something called local governments, and this would be city, state, and county. So within the national government, the city, state, and county also has their own governments, but all local governments must comply with our national constitution. Now, the Constitution has been very flexible over time, and we have seen the Constitution last for over 200 years. And in fact, has only been formally changed 27 times for 27 amendments. And the reason for this is that the founders of our country anticipated change that would come in the form of amendments. They knew that they were writing a document that was setting up a government, first of all, that had never been established in our world. They didn't have a blueprint. Nobody had this type of federal republic before, and so they were basically starting from scratch. They couldn't learn from anybody else's mistakes. The beauty of it, though, is that they knew that things were going to change over time, and they said, you know, if this document is going to last, we're going to have to allow things to change. So they set up the amendment process that would change the Constitution when and if needed. Now, this is pretty genius of the Founding Fathers, because you're talking about men who wrote this Constitution who did not have conveniences of modern technology. They didn't have cell phones, they didn't have computers, they were riding around on horses. They didn't have deodorant like we do today. They were smelly people. They were just very different. And it's very cool that now our Supreme Court is reviewing social media and how that applies to slander and freedom of speech and so forth. Today, under the same document that these men riding around on horses wrote for us under which to live. Now, there are 4 ways to amend the Constitution or change it that can be found in Article 5. And we're only going to look at one way, and it's because 26 of the 27 amendments were adopted this way. And that is a 2/3 vote in each house of Congress, that is House and Senate, ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures, which makes for 38 states. So this is the conclusion of Lesson 2, the Constitution.